The clock on the police station wall ticked past midnight as Officer Kim settled into her chair, warming her hands around a cup of coffee. The night shift in Millbrook wasn't usually exciting, but that's exactly why she had chosen this quiet suburban posting. After 7 years on the force, she'd seen enough excitement in the city to last a lifetime. The gentle hum of the police station's heating system and the occasional crackle of the radio created a familiar comfort. She could hear Officer Rodriguez laughing with the desk sergeant about his kid's latest baseball game and the soft clicking of Detective Walsh's keyboard as she finished up her paperwork from the day shift. Kim took another sip of her coffee, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste of the station's infamous brew. She'd forgotten her honey at home again. Just as she was considering making a quick run to the 24-hour convenience store across the street, the dispatch radio crackled to life. Unit 247, we have a call about unusual sounds at 1542 Cedar Grove Lane. Resident is Mrs. Wilson, elderly caller, reports hearing strange noises from her basement for the past few nights. Something in the dispatcher's voice made Kim sit up straighter. She knew Mrs. Wilson from her regular neighborhood patrols, a sharp-minded retired schoolteacher who spent her mornings tending to her prize-winning rose garden. Not someone who'd call without good reason. Copy that, Kim responded, already reaching for her jacket. Is the caller in any immediate danger? Negative, the dispatcher replied. But Mrs. Wilson sounds unsettled. She specifically mentioned that the sounds are different from anything she's heard in her 30 years in the house. As Kim walked to her patrol car, memories of her previous interactions with Mrs. Wilson flashed through her mind. The woman had always been level-headed, even during last summer's severe storm when a tree had crashed through her fence. She'd calmly directed the emergency crews while serving them homemade lemonade. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Kim's boots crunched on the gravel as she did a quick check of her gear. Flashlight, radio, everything in place. The familiar weight of her equipment belt provided a reassuring comfort as she slid behind the wheel. Driving through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Kim couldn't shake the feeling that this call would be different. Maybe it was the way the dispatcher's voice had wavered slightly, or perhaps it was her own instincts developed over years of service. The streets were nearly empty, with only the occasional late-night dog walker or teenager heading home before curfew. The houses in this part of town were mostly built in the 1960s, solid structures with well-maintained lawns and mature trees. Mrs. Wilson's place was one of the originals, a ranch-style home with cream-colored siding and dark green shutters. As Kim pulled up to the curb, she noticed the porch light was on, and warm light spilled from the living room windows. She took a moment to radio her arrival and observe the property. Nothing seemed immediately out of place. The garden tools were neatly arranged on the porch, and Mrs. Wilson's old Volvo sat in the driveway. But years of experience had taught Kim that the most interesting cases often started with the most ordinary scenes. As she stepped out of her patrol car, a cool breeze rustled through the maple trees lining the street. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows across the well-kept lawn. Kim adjusted her body camera and started up the front walk, her footsteps seeming unusually loud in the quiet neighborhood. Just as she reached for the doorbell, she heard it, faint but distinct. A sound that definitely didn't belong in a quiet suburban home at this hour. It wasn't threatening or violent, but rather melancholic. Almost like someone was crying, but mixed with something else she couldn't quite identify. Kim's hand moved instinctively to rest near her radio as she pressed the doorbell. This wasn't going to be just another routine noise complaint. Her gut told her she was about to step into something much more interesting. What she didn't know yet was that this call would lead her to uncover a story that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone involved in unexpected ways. Mrs. Wilson opened the door before the chime had fully faded, her usual composed demeanor slightly ruffled. She wore a neat cardigan over her nightgown, her silver hair pulled back in a tidy bun, but her hands were clasped tightly together, a sign of the anxiety she was trying to hide. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, officer," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious concern. "I know it might sound silly to call about strange noises, but—" She paused, glancing over her shoulder toward the hallway leading to the basement door. "Well, perhaps you should hear it for yourself." Officer Kim stepped into Mrs. Wilson's warmly lit foyer, immediately noticing the familiar scent of fresh-baked cookies mixing with the gentle fragrance of lavender air freshener. Family photos lined the walls, telling the story of a life well lived. Children growing up, graduations, weddings, and precious moments frozen in time. The house felt lived in and loved, making the reported strange sounds seem even more out of place. "I've been hearing it for 3 nights now," Mrs. Wilson explained, leading Kim through the living room. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the coffee table next to a cup of chamomile tea, evidence of what should have been a peaceful evening routine. "At first, I thought it might be the heating system acting up again, but," she wrung her hands together, a gesture that spoke volumes about her unease. Kim noticed how Mrs. Wilson's eyes kept darting toward the hallway that led to the basement door. The elderly woman's usual confident demeanor had given way to something more vulnerable, though she was clearly trying to maintain her composure. That subtle shift in behavior told Kim more than words could. Whatever was happening here had genuinely rattled this normally unshakable woman. "Would you mind walking me through exactly when you first noticed these sounds?" Kim asked, pulling out her notepad. She kept her voice calm and professional, but friendly, a tone she'd perfected over years of community policing. Mrs. Wilson settled into her favorite armchair, the worn fabric testament to countless evenings spent reading or watching television. It was Monday night, just after the evening news. I was about to head upstairs when I heard what sounded like someone crying. But it wasn't just crying. There was music too, very faint, like an old record playing. As if on cue, a muffled sound drifted up from below. Kim's trained ear picked up what Mrs. Wilson had described. A strange mixture of soft sobbing and what seemed to be vintage jazz music, so faint it was barely audible. The sound had an ethereal quality that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "There. Did you hear that?" Mrs. Wilson whispered, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. "It's been like this each night, starting around the same time." "I thought I was imagining things at first, but—" Kim moved quietly toward the hallway, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. The sound grew slightly clearer, definitely music, and definitely someone crying. But there was something else about it that she couldn't quite put her finger on, something that made it feel more melancholic than menacing. "Has anyone else been in the house recently?" Kim asked, maintaining a professional demeanor while her mind worked through the possibilities. "Any maintenance workers, family members, or visitors?" Mrs. Wilson shook her head. "Just my daughter Lisa, who comes by on Sundays for dinner. And the plumber last month, but he only worked on the upstairs bathroom." She paused, then added, "My husband built this house, you know. I know every creaky floorboard, every settling sound it makes. This is different." The mention of her husband brought a softness to Mrs. Wilson's voice. Kim noticed her glance at a photo on the side table, a military man in dress uniform, standing proud beside a much younger Mrs. Wilson. The picture had the slightly faded quality of photos from decades past. "Would you feel comfortable if we checked the basement?" Kim asked, already reaching for her flashlight. She'd investigated hundreds of noise complaints over the years, but something about this one felt different. The atmosphere wasn't charged with fear so much as with anticipation. Mrs. Wilson stood up, straightening her cardigan with trembling hands. "Yes, of course. Though I haven't been down there much since Robert passed. He used to." She trailed off, lost in memory for a moment. "He spent a lot of time down there in his workshop," said it reminded him of his service days. As they approached the basement door, the sounds became more distinct. The music had a scratchy quality to it, like an old vinyl record that had seen better days. The crying seemed to ebb and flow with the melody, creating an oddly haunting harmony. Kim placed her hand on the door handle, feeling the cool brass beneath her fingers. The solid oak door looked original to the house, its wood worn smooth by decades of use. She could feel Mrs. Wilson standing close behind her, drawn by a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Stay behind me, please," Kim instructed gently, her training kicking in even as her curiosity peaked. She switched on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness at the top of the stairs. The beam revealed worn carpet treads, carefully maintained despite their age. As she took the first step down, the stair creaked softly under her weight, a sound that seemed to momentarily overpower the mysterious melody floating up from below. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying the musty smell of old books and wood shavings common to basement workshops. Mrs. Wilson's breathing was steady but audible behind her as they made their way down. Each step brought them closer to the source of the sounds, which now seemed to be coming from behind a closed door at the far end of the basement. Kim's flashlight beam revealed walls lined with storage shelves and old family photographs, each casting long shadows that danced as they moved. The workshop door stood before them, solid and unremarkable except for the soft sounds emanating from behind it. Kim raised her hand to knock, then paused, listening intently. The crying had changed somehow. It now sounded less like sobbing and more like humming. The jazz music had continued its gentle rhythm, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere in the cool basement air. The basement air grew heavier with each step as Officer Kim and Mrs. Wilson approached the workshop door. The music had become clearer now, a gentle jazz melody that Kim recognized but couldn't quite name. It had that warm, crackling sound that only comes from vinyl records, the kind her grandfather used to play on Sunday afternoons. That song, Mrs. Wilson whispered, her voice catching slightly. Robert used to play it all the time. It was our wedding song, in the wee small hours of the morning. He had the original record from 1955. Her fingers brushed against a wooden shelf, leaving trails in the dust. Kim adjusted her flashlight beam, noticing how the light caught the floating dust particles, making them dance like tiny stars in the basement's darkness. The humming had grown louder, matching the melody perfectly, as if whoever was behind that door knew every note by heart. "Is there another way into the basement?" Kim asked softly, a training prompting her to gather all the relevant information. She kept her voice low, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening behind the door just yet. Mrs. Wilson nodded, pointing to a corner of the basement. "There's an old storm shelter entrance on the side of the house. Robert insisted on it when we built the place, said it reminded him of the bunkers from his service days. But it's been locked for years, hasn't it?" The uncertainty in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely sure anymore. The record skipped slightly, causing both women to start. The humming continued uninterrupted through the skip, confirming what Kim had suspected. There was definitely someone in that room. She moved closer to the door, listening intently. The humming had a quality to it that spoke of deep emotion, not threat or danger. "Mrs. Wilson," Kim whispered, "would you mind waiting at the bottom of the stairs? I'll check the room first." She kept her tone gentle but firm, the kind that reassured while leaving no room for argument. The older woman hesitated, then nodded, taking a few steps back. The dim light from upstairs cast her shadow long across the concrete floor, mixing with the shadows of old tools hanging on the walls. Robert's workshop, Kim noticed, was still set up as if waiting for his return. Chisels lined up neatly on pegboards, sawdust frozen in time on the workbench visible through the doorway. Kim placed her hand on the door handle, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingers. The handle turned smoothly, suggesting recent use. The hinges, though old, didn't make a sound as she slowly pushed the door open. Someone had oiled them recently. The beam of her flashlight swept across the room, revealing a space that was both familiar and strange. The workshop opened into what was clearly a converted bomb shelter, its walls lined with steel reinforcement visible behind years of careful improvements. Robert had transformed it into something between a workshop and a private retreat, with comfortable old chairs and shelves filled with books and records. In the corner, an old record player sat on a sturdy table, its turntable spinning that haunting melody into the dim light. Next to it, a collection of vinyl records was carefully arranged, each sleeve worn with love and use. The humming was coming from behind a large workbench, where shadows suggested someone sitting on the floor. Kim took a careful step into the room, her training mooring with her instincts. Everything about this scene spoke of sadness rather than danger, of seeking shelter rather than causing harm. The humming paused for a moment, then continued, a voice rough with emotion joining the music more fully now. "Hello," she called out softly, keeping her flashlight beam low to avoid startling whoever was there. "I'm Officer Kim. I'm here to help, not to cause any trouble." The humming stopped, replaced by a shuffling sound. A figure slowly stood up from behind the workbench. An older man, his clothes worn but clean, his face bearing the weathered look of someone who'd spent too many nights outdoors. but it was his eyes that caught Kim's attention. They were filled not with fear or defiance, but with a deep, overwhelming sadness. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice matching the humming they'd heard, rough but gentle. "I didn't mean to frighten anyone. This place," he gestured around the workshop, "it reminds me of somewhere I used to know, somewhere safe." From the doorway, Mrs. Wilson gasped softly. The sound drew the man's attention, and something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, or shame. He straightened up slightly, the posture of a military man emerging through years of civilian life. Kim kept her flashlight steady, watching as the man's eyes moved from Mrs. Wilson to the photographs on the wall, then back again. There was a story here, she could feel it, something that connected this stranger to this place in ways that weren't yet clear. The record continued to play, filling the silence with its gentle melody, as if providing a soundtrack to a moment balanced between past and present, between fear and understanding. The workshop seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Through the small window near the ceiling, moonlight filtered in, mixing with Kim's flashlight beam to cast double shadows on the walls. The tools hanging on the walls, the old chairs, the carefully organized records, everything seemed to be watching, waiting for the next chapter of their story to unfold. The record player crackled softly in the background as Officer Kim took in the scene before her. The man stood quietly, his posture straight despite his obvious exhaustion. His clothes were worn but clean, someone trying hard to maintain dignity in difficult circumstances. The moonlight streaming through the small basement window caught the silver in his hair, matching the gleam of dog tags barely visible under his collar. "I found the outside entrance unlocked 3 nights ago," he explained, his voice carrying the weight of countless untold stories. "I just needed somewhere warm to stay for a bit. When I saw all this," he gestured around the workshop, his hand trembling slightly. It was like stepping back in time. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward into the room, her initial fear replaced by something closer to curiosity. "You're a veteran," she said softly. It wasn't a question. After decades of marriage to one, she could spot the signs, the way he stood, how his eyes constantly tracked the exits, the instinctive respect in his bearing. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, straightening even more. "Vietnam. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." His eyes drifted to a photograph on the wall, and Kim followed his gaze. The picture showed a group of young Marines, their faces a mixture of bravado and innocence that war would soon erase. Kim moved closer to the photograph, her flashlight beam illuminating faces frozen in time. Something about it tugged at her memory. A similar photo she kept tucked in her patrol car's visor, one of her father in his younger days. As she studied the faces, her heart suddenly skipped a beat. There, in the middle of the group, was a face she'd seen countless times in her family albums. Her father, looking impossibly young, arm thrown around the shoulders of. She turned to look at the man standing in the workshop, decades older but with the same distinctive jawline as the young Marine in the photo. "You knew my father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You served with Lieutenant Park." The man's eyes widened with recognition. "Little Jenny Park?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Mike's daughter." The use of her childhood nickname, one only her father's closest friends would know, confirmed everything. Mrs. Wilson moved to turn on a small desk lamp, casting a warm glow across the workshop. In the better light, Kim could see tears forming in the man's eyes. He reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a carefully preserved photograph, the same one Kim kept in her car, but less faded, as if it had been protected from light all these years. "Your father saved my life," he said quietly, running a weathered finger along the edge of the photo. "Twice, actually. Once in combat and once when I'd lost my way after coming home. He never gave up on any of us." Kim felt her professional demeanor cracking slightly. Her father had passed away when she was 12, taking with him so many untold stories of his service years. She joined the force partly because of his belief in protecting others, but there were so many questions she'd never got to ask him. "You're his spitting image, you know," the man continued, a slight smile softening his weathered features. "He had that same way of standing, like you're ready for anything but still completely at ease. He'd be proud, seeing you in that uniform." Mrs. Wilson had moved to an old filing cabinet, pulling open a drawer with practiced ease. "Robert kept everything," she explained, withdrawing a thick album. "Every letter, every photo from his service days. He said we needed to remember not just the war, but the brotherhood. The album fell open to a page showing more photos of the same group of Marines. Kim recognized her father in several shots, playing cards, cleaning weapons, sharing cigarettes. Everyday moments made extraordinary by time and circumstance, and in almost every photo, there was the man standing before them, younger but with the same kind eyes. "I don't even know your name," Kim realized, suddenly aware of how this chance encounter had bypassed normal procedures and protocols. "Tom," he replied simply. "Your father always called me Tommy, even after we made it home," said it reminded him of better days. He paused, looking around the workshop. "I never thought I'd see these photos again. When I lost touch with everyone after Mike's passing, well, some memories are harder to face alone." Mrs. Wilson settled into one of the old chairs, the album open on her lap. "Robert used to play these records and tell me stories about his unit," she said. "Different war, same brotherhood. He always said a veteran's heart recognizes its own kind." The record player had fallen silent, the needle hitting the end groove with a soft click. The quiet that followed felt heavy with unspoken stories and shared understanding. Kim found herself looking at the workshop with new eyes, not just as a police officer investigating a call, but as a daughter discovering pieces of her father's life she thought were lost forever. Tom moved to change the record, his hands gentle with the vinyl. "Your father loved this one," he said, carefully placing the needle. The opening notes of "What a Wonderful World" filled the room, and Kim felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. It had been her father's favorite. She remembered him humming it while working in the garden, dancing to it with her mother in the kitchen. The three of them stood in the warm lamplight, surrounded by memories both painful and precious. This wasn't just about a homeless veteran finding shelter anymore. It was about connections thought lost, stories waiting to be told, and the unexpected ways the past reaches forward to touch the present. The old record player filled the workshop with Louis Armstrong's gentle voice as Tom settled into one of the worn leather chairs. His hands, rough from years of hard work and harder living, carefully held the photo album Mrs. Wilson had brought down. Officer Kim watched as he turned each page with reverence, as if handling precious artifacts from a forgotten temple. "Your father wrote to me every month for 5 years after we came home," Tom said, his finger tracing the edge of a yellowed envelope tucked between the pages. "Even when I couldn't write back, even when I was in no state to read them, he never gave up on me." Kim pulled up an old workshop stool, her uniform creaking slightly as she sat. The night had transformed from a routine noise complaint into something deeply personal. "What was he like?" she asked softly. "In the service, I mean." "I was so young when he passed. Mom doesn't talk about those days much." Tom's eyes grew distant, seeing beyond the workshop walls to memories decades old. "Mike was our rock," he began, his voice warm with remembrance. "Not just as our lieutenant, but as a friend. He had this way about him, could make you laugh even on the worst days. Kept us human when the world was trying its hardest to make us forget how." Mrs. Wilson had busied herself making coffee on an old percolator in the corner, another remnant of her husband's workshop days. The familiar scent mixed with the musty air of the basement, creating an atmosphere that felt somehow both nostalgic and present. "I remember this day," Tom said, pointing to a photograph of the unit gathered around a makeshift table. "Your father had somehow gotten hold of a birthday cake, must have called in every favor he had. It was for Private Wilson, just a kid, really, turned 19 in the field." He paused, swallowing hard. Mike knew how important those moments were, keeping us connected to home, to who we were. Kim found herself leaning forward, drinking in every detail. Each story was like a piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to complete since childhood. "Did he talk about us? About home?" Tom's face softened into a smile. "All the time. He carried your picture everywhere, showed it to anyone who'd look. Called you his little warrior because you were always trying to climb trees in your mom's garden." He chuckled softly. "Said you had more guts than half his unit." The coffee percolator sputtered to completion, and Mrs. Wilson began pouring the steaming liquid into old ceramic mugs. The domestic normalcy of the action seemed to ground them all, bringing them back to the present moment while still holding space for the past. "After we got home," Tom continued, accepting a mug with grateful hands, "your father was the one who helped me find my footing again. When the nightmares got bad, when the world seemed too loud and too quiet all at once, he'd show up at my door. Sometimes we'd talk, sometimes we'd just sit and listen to jazz records like this one. He gestured to the record player, where Armstrong's trumpet was painting pictures of a wonderful world. He understood that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about remembering who we were while accepting who we'd become. Kim felt tears threatening again, but didn't try to hide them. Her father had always taught her that tears were just another way of speaking truth. "I remember him playing these records," she said. "He put them on Sunday mornings while making breakfast. Mom would pretend to complain about the noise, but she'd end up dancing with him in the kitchen." Mrs. Wilson settled into her chair, her own mug warming her hands. "Robert was the same way," she offered. "Said music helped quiet the memories when they got too loud. These old jazz records, they speak a language only some hearts understand." Tom nodded, understanding flowing between them. "Your father had a saying," he said to Kim. "The best way to honor the past is to live fully in the present." He lived that truth every day, being a soldier, a friend, a husband, a father. Never let one part overshadow the others. The workshop felt different now, transformed by shared memories and newfound connections. What had started as a potential threat had become a bridge between past and present, between loss and discovery. Kim found herself studying Tom's face, seeing hints of the young Marine he'd been in the weathered features of the man before her. After Mike passed, Tom said quietly, "I lost my way again. Couldn't face his family, couldn't face myself. Started walking and never really stopped. But finding this place, seeing these photos, hearing his favorite music again." He trailed off, emotion making his voice rough. "Maybe it's time to stop walking." Kim reached out and gently touched the dog tags hanging from his neck. They were worn smooth by years of worry and remembrance. "Dad would want you to have a home," she said softly. "He always said the measure of a life wasn't in the battles fought, but in the people loved." Mrs. Wilson set her coffee down with quiet determination. "Well," she said, her voice carrying the practical strength of someone used to making things happen, "this house has been too quiet since Robert passed. The spare room upstairs has been gathering dust, and the garden could use a strong pair of hands." The offer hung in the air, simple and profound. Tom's hands tightened around his mug, his eyes fixed on the photographs spread before him. The record played on, filling the silence with gentle understanding as three lives, connected by threads of memory and circumstance, stood on the brink of something new. The next few hours passed in a blur of action and emotion. Officer Kim had radioed in to explain the situation, her voice steady despite the personal nature of the discovery. Her supervisor, a veteran himself, understood immediately. "Handle it how you see fit," he'd said, the crackle of the radio unable to hide the warmth in his voice. "Some situations need heart more than protocol." Tom sat at Mrs. Wilson's kitchen table now, the harsh fluorescent light of early morning softened by the steam rising from a fresh cup of coffee. The basement workshop had been locked up again, but not before they'd carefully packed up the most precious photographs and letters to bring upstairs. The old record player would stay where it was, a bridge between past and present in the quiet space below. "The spare room gets the morning sun," Mrs. Wilson explained, bustling around the kitchen with renewed energy. She'd already called her daughter to explain the situation, and the response had been immediate and positive. "Lisa's bringing over some of her husband's old clothes later today. He's about your size, I think." Kim watched the scene unfold while making necessary phone calls to veteran services. Her official shift had ended hours ago, but some moments in life demanded full attention, regardless of the clock. Each call added another piece to the puzzle of support they were building: medical care, counseling services, job training programs. The system could work, she knew, when people took the time to care. "I can't accept all this," Tom protested weakly, but his eyes told a different story. They held a glimmer of something that had been missing in the basement: hope. "It's too much trouble." Mrs. Wilson paused in her morning routine, fixing him with a look that brooked no argument. "Robert always said trouble is just opportunity wearing work clothes. Besides," she added, her voice softening, "this house needs life in it again. Needs someone who understands why there's a workshop full of memories in the basement, why there are flag cases on the walls, why some songs matter more than others." Kim finished her last call and joined them at the table. The morning light was streaming through the kitchen windows now, painting everything in shades of gold. Dad would say this isn't chance, she said quietly. He believed some souls are meant to find each other, even if it takes a lifetime. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. Mike always did have a way of arranging things, he said with a wet chuckle. Even from beyond, apparently. He pulled out his worn wallet, carefully extracting a folded piece of paper, a letter, its creases deep from years of reading and rereading. Your father wrote this to me just before he passed, he explained, smoothing the paper on the table. I never answered it. Was carrying too much guilt, too much pain. But he knew somehow. Listen to this. He cleared his throat and read aloud. Remember, Tommy, home isn't just a place. It's where your heart recognizes itself in others. Keep looking until you find it again. Mrs. Wilson wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, not bothering to hide her tears. Robert would say the same thing. Must be something they teach in military wisdom school, she added with a watery smile. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking this moment of transformation. Through the window, early morning joggers passed by, dogs walked their owners, and the world continued its normal rhythm. But inside this sunny kitchen, lives were being reshaped by the power of memory and chance. I'll need to file some paperwork at the station, Kim said, her professional tone gentled by understanding. Get everything official. But first, she pulled out her phone, scrolling through to find a photo she'd taken earlier of the unit picture from the basement. I'd like to hear more about this day. About all of them, really. Tom leaned forward, his face lighting up with recognition. That was just after a 3-day patrol. Your father had somehow found a camera. He paused, looking between Kim and Mrs. Wilson. If you're sure you want to hear these old stories. Stories are how we keep people alive in our hearts, Mrs. Wilson said firmly, settling into her chair with another pot of coffee. And this kitchen has been waiting too long to hear new ones. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, warming the well-tended rose garden where Mrs. Wilson spent her summers. Soon, she knew, those flowers would have a new admirer, someone who understood why she named each bush after a memory. The spare room upstairs would hold more than just guest linens and old boxes. It would shelter a soul finding its way home. Kim watched as Tom began to share another story, his voice growing stronger with each word. She thought about her father, about all the threads of love and memory that had led to this moment. A noise complaint had turned into something miraculous, proof that sometimes the best police work happened when protocol met compassion. The kitchen filled with morning light and gentle laughter as Tom described one of her father's famous practical jokes. Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkled as she recognized the universal language of military humor, so similar to her Robert's stories. And somewhere, Kim felt certain, 2 old soldiers were smiling at the scene unfolding in this warm kitchen, at the way their loved ones had found each other in the gentle hours of a spring morning. 3 months had passed since that extraordinary night shift, and Officer Kim's patrol car pulled up to Mrs. Wilson's house once again. This time, though, she wasn't responding to a call. The summer evening was warm and gentle, with the scent of Mrs. Wilson's roses drifting on the breeze. The garden looked better than ever, with new beds of vegetables adding to the colorful landscape. As she walked up the path, Kim could hear laughter floating from the backyard. The sound brought a smile to her face. It had become a familiar Thursday evening ritual. Her mother was already there. Kim recognized her voice mixing with the others. These weekly gatherings had become something all of them looked forward to, a time when memories and present moments wove together seamlessly. She rounded the corner of the house to find them all seated around the patio table. Tom was at the grill, wearing an apron that declared veterans make better cooks, a gift from Mrs. Wilson's daughter Lisa. The transformation in him over these months was remarkable. Regular meals, a stable home, and most importantly, a sense of purpose had brought back the man her father had known. There she is, her mother called out, waving her over. Tom was just about to tell us another story about your father's famous kitchen experiments in the field. Her mother's eyes sparkled with joy these days, finally able to share and hear stories about her late husband without the weight of solitary grief. Mrs. Wilson was arranging a plate of her famous cookies, their silver hair catching the evening light. The house behind her had come alive again, flowers in every window, the sounds of life and laughter in its rooms, and most importantly, the basement workshop was no longer a silent museum to memories. Tom had carefully restored it, keeping its character while making it a living space again. Just in time, Tom said, flipping a burger with expert care. I was telling them about the time your father tried to make beef stew using sea rations and wild mushrooms. Nearly gave our whole unit food poisoning. His laugh was free and easy now, the kind that came from a place of healing. Kim settled into an empty chair, accepting a glass of lemonade from her mother. The table was laden with summer dishes: potato salad, fresh corn, Mrs. Wilson's famous coleslaw. But the real feast was in the stories they shared, each one adding another layer to their understanding of the men who had shaped their lives. Remember what we found last week? Mrs. Wilson said, reaching for a photo album they now kept on the patio bookshelf. Tom discovered another box of Robert's old letters in the workshop. There was one from Mike in there too. They'd served together briefly in training. Kim watched as her mother leaned in to see the letter, her fingers gently touching the faded paper. These discoveries had become regular occurrences, each one a small treasure that helped fill in the gaps of their shared history. The workshop had proven to be a treasure trove of memories, each drawer and shelf holding pieces of the past waiting to be rediscovered. Your father would love this, Tom said, joining them at the table with a plate of perfectly grilled burgers. All of us here sharing stories, keeping memories alive. He always said the best medicine for a troubled soul was good food and better company. The evening air was filled with the sound of cicadas singing their summer song, mixing with the gentle music drifting from the portable record player Tom now carried between house and patio. He'd started collecting his own records again, adding new memories to the old ones stored in the basement. Oh, tell Kim about the job, Mrs. Wilson exclaimed suddenly. The Veterans Center called today. Tom's face lit up with quiet pride. They offered me a position as a peer counselor, he said my experience could help other vets find their way back. He paused, emotion making his voice rough. Your father did that for me once. Seems right to pass it on. Kim felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were happy tears. She thought about that night 3 months ago, how a simple noise complaint could have gone so differently. If she hadn't taken the time to listen, to look deeper, to follow her instincts about the sadness in that music. Sometimes the best moments in life come from the strangest beginnings, her mother said, as if reading her thoughts. Mike always said that too, said you had to keep your heart open to the unexpected. Mrs. Wilson raised her lemonade glass. To unexpected blessings, she said softly, and to the men who taught us how to recognize them. They all raised their glasses in the golden evening light. The roses bobbed their heads in the gentle breeze, their fragrance mixing with the smell of grilled food and summer grass. From somewhere inside the house, Louis Armstrong's trumpet softly declared what a wonderful world it was, and for once, the statement felt absolutely true. As the evening deepened into twilight, fireflies began to dance in Mrs. Wilson's garden. Tom started another story, this one about a quiet moment during the war when her father had gathered the unit to watch a sunset. He said we had to remember that beauty still existed. Tom recalled that it was waiting for us back home. Kim looked around the table at these people who had become family in the truest sense. A noise complaint had brought them together, but love, understanding, and the threads of shared memory had woven them into something precious and real. The workshop below held its memories now not in silence, but in harmony with the life above. And somewhere, she was certain, her father and Robert were smiling, knowing that their legacy lived on in this gathering of souls who had found each other in the most unexpected of ways.